This is it. We're walking into Kabul city. We don't seem to have any problems around us. There's only people that are friendly and are saying, chanting, I'm afraid, kill the Taliban.
Tonight, we look back in relative tranquility now at the road to Kabul. This is the story of what the war was like from the BBC teams on both sides of the line. It's the end of a week when the United States bombing of Afghanistan seems to have worked better than many of its critics ever imagined. But in opening the way to Kabul, the war has also unleashed a new contest over who's going to run the new post-war Afghanistan. For a month, I'd been living with the Northern Alliance 25 miles outside Kabul. They weren't particularly well equipped, and they had a reputation, unjustified as it turned out, for indiscipline. They certainly weren't as united as they ought to have been, except in their determination to get rid of the Taliban. Nor did they represent the country as a whole. At this stage, they had very little, if any, support from the Pashto speakers who make up 40% of the population. The Americans, at Pakistan's constant prompting, were suspicious of them, and even when the bombing began at the start of October, it seemed to the Northern Alliance to be half-hearted. Everywhere I went along the front line, I found a sense of uncertainty. No one knew when or even if the Northern Alliance would make the final push for the capital.
Those who think there will be one say it'll happen soon. They also say that the big new American raids are proof of that.
Meanwhile, on the road from the Pakistan border, my colleague William Reeve was on his way back to Kabul. He had persuaded the Taliban to let him back in, having been the BBC's correspondent there for 4 years. Now he was the first Western broadcaster to be allowed back behind Taliban lines.
It's 2 years since I've been here. It's going to be quite a hard call, this trip, I think. One thing that's happened, I've found in Afghanistan over the years, is that one can be fine for weeks on end, and then suddenly something happens, and it's always the unexpected things that happen.
"10 days ago, as we made our way up to Kabul, we came across this vast tented refugee camp outside Jalalabad. Afghans have suffered so much in more than 20 years of conflict. But in the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, there's always time for a bit of propaganda. Praise for the Taliban, damnation for the West. However unwelcome we might find their message, British journalists were a very rare sight indeed. An opportunity to taunt us about the West's most wanted man was too good to miss. In Kabul, still safely in Taliban hands, people continue their daily lives as best they can. We arrived 1 month after the American bombardment had begun.
We've reached Kabul at last. It's not a lot changed so far from here, apart from those buildings we've just seen that had been destroyed just outside town.
The plight of women hasn't changed either. Oppressed and beaten by the Taliban, the American bombing made their situation worse. As these women queued for Western food aid, Taliban discipline was meted out. These old friends had kept the BBC house come office, where I lived before as a correspondent, safe and sound since the Taliban had expelled the BBC from Kabul 8 months before.
How are you? Oh, nice to see you. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
25 miles away, on the front line, the American military continued to soften up the Taliban defences, if slowly. But the American politicians weren't at all sure about letting the Northern Alliance take the city. When they'd last controlled Kabul, there'd been a ferocious civil war and appalling human rights abuses. Much of this, though not all, was done by factions encouraged by outside countries. But now the Northern Alliance had better weapons, including tanks and armoured personnel carriers supplied by the Russians. They laid on quite a fine military display.
Within the next couple of days, the leaders of the Northern Alliance will be holding a top-level meeting to decide how and when to start the big push on Kabul. Some of them feel that the pressure's building up so much, it's going to be impossible to stop them now.
Our BBC colleagues, getting used to life back in Kabul, were shown a monument to military success.
The Taliban had on display what they claimed was the wreckage of an American helicopter they'd shot down near Kandahar.
He says that God is great. Shoot down another one.
This location has a grim past. 5 years earlier, they hung the body of former communist President Najibullah in the same place. Don't mess with us, the Taliban were saying. But the big test was drawing closer.
Around 2 o'clock on the afternoon of Monday, November the 12th, the Northern Alliance began the race for Kabul. This footage was shot by someone who was actually taking part in the fighting. He was a young man who joined the Northern Alliance 10 years ago. General Massoud, the military leader of the alliance, later assassinated, told him that rather than being a gunman, he should be a cameraman. And so Yusuf Yan Nesar, armed only with a camera, did his bit and captured these images of the war. And he showed the grisly reality of the whole thing. Further on, next to a deserted hut, lies a Taliban soldier shot in the leg. Like the young Afghan cameraman, the BBC team was up with the first wave of attack as the Northern Alliance smashed through every defensive position to the north of the capital. The BBC team had been waiting a month for the attack, and when it came, it was ferocious. Arabs and Pakistanis fighting with the Taliban were singled out for slaughter.
Pakistan.
Further down the road, another foreign volunteer for the Taliban, an elderly Turk, was made to suffer.
Well, this is it. The second line of defense around Kabul. The Taliban have all gone, either been taken prisoners or run for it back in the direction of Kabul, which is now only about 12 or 13 kilometers away from here. It's a rout. The Northern Alliance are just carving through like a knife through butter.
By nightfall, the soldiers were only about 10 miles from Kabul. They could afford to rest. But But the Americans continued their deadly onslaught on the city from the air. From his position inside the capital, our BBC man William Reeve was broadcasting live to the world.
There were a few trucks piled with personal possessions going one way or the other. But otherwise, there's not much people can do. Where do they go? All they can do is stay at home and hope for the best.
We've heard reports, William, that Taliban fighters have been seen heading north of the Kabul. Have you seen evidence of that?
Jesus Christ. Down in the basement. Down in the basement.
A large bomb had completely destroyed a house 2 doors away, where locals said a group of Taliban had been living. All the windows of our house were smashed, doors blown off their hinges. We weren't going to wait around for another attack.
Take this off. No, it's, I'm fine.
No, I know, but you might not.
It was quite extraordinary. The glass break just behind you. Oh, everything smashed. It was an incredibly loud noise. It was quite alarming. Incredibly unexpected when you have... Anyway, there'll be a few houses around here with a lot of broken glass. I'm fine.
We left at great speed, and with our local fixer come guard, himself a Talib, set off across Kabul to a hotel where we thought we might be safer. That chaotic night, the Taliban were suddenly giving up the city. Truckloads were quitting the fight. Convoys were in retreat. But in the town centre, at a checkpoint, we were held up. The tension was obvious. Everyone was very jumpy. The Taliban wanted our camera.
BBC journalist. Camera.
They took the camera, but they didn't know it was still switched on and recording sound. And as they carried the camera away, they talked about war and defeat. But after what seemed an eternity, they let us go and gave us back our camera. Our local Talib fixer cum guard had saved the day. His war was now over. He just wanted to get back to his family. But we were safe.
Thank you, sir.
Quite frankly, the Americans who did the bombing obviously couldn't care less about our presence there.
What the Americans had also destroyed that night was the Kabul office of the Arab news agency Al Jazeera, the television station which had regularly been given bin Laden tapes during the conflict. They'd been specially delivered to this building, ready for transmission by Al Jazeera to the world. But not anymore.
It was just before dawn that the wild dash for Kabul developed. Thousands of soldiers intent on capturing the capital. It seemed to take no time at all to cover the 10 or so miles. As we drew nearer to Kabul, the grim evidence of battle. These were former supporters of the Northern Alliance who'd switched sides and joined the Taliban. No mercy for them. Then we saw they'd captured another man. The presence of our camera probably saved his life. He was paralyzed with terror. By now, there were no Taliban left to resist. Then came the critical moment. Would the Northern Alliance simply race on and pour into Kabul itself, even though they'd undertaken not to? The commander in charge was determined not to let it happen. He ordered the armoured vehicles to block the way. The great advance was stopped in its tracks. Kabul lay temptingly close below us now. the small BBC team decided to head on into the city on our own and on foot, so no one would think we were soldiers. We ploughed on.
Well, this is it. We're walking into Kabul city. We don't seem to have any problems around us. There's only people that are friendly and are saying, chanting, I'm afraid, kill the Taliban. But as we understand it, as we walk in here, there aren't going to be that many Taliban anyway.
It was 7:53 a.m. local time. Kabul was a free city. In the centre of town, when we got there, we watched a group of foreign Taliban volunteers being hunted down. This man is an Arab. He gets particularly brutal treatment. In the jeep, there are other Taliban prisoners. This one's an Arab too, perhaps an Egyptian. The other two are Afghans. On the other side of town too, our BBC team was finding more evidence of street justice being meted out by local people.
Here too, it was the Arabs and Pakistanis, the foreign fighters who'd come to aid the Taliban in their holy war, who were singled out for summary justice. In the initial hours after the routing of the Taliban, something close to gun law seemed to prevail. There was a vacuum of authority before the Northern Alliance arrived.
Another sort of revolution was taking place in Kabul, a real liberation. Suddenly you could hear music. Yesterday, any music made with instruments was banned. Overnight, the old order had vanished, and with it, the extreme religious restrictions on life under the Taliban.
Now we are feeling good, yeah, about the going off the Taliban.
People is very happy about this situation because the Taliban was very serious about Islam. Islam has a very good religion, but they use this Islam in bad situation, in bad way.
Today, if they choose, women can walk free. A few begin to show their faces. They can even wear makeup if they want to. Yesterday, women were whipped for not covering up. Today, a close shave is a political statement, a way of cutting free from the past. Yesterday, beards weren't a matter of choice for men, they were a matter of religious law. Yesterday, girls couldn't go to school at all. Today in Afghanistan, everyone can go to school. This classroom was used for storing shells. Now it's going back to its proper usage.
People, in many ways, are freer because the religious police did have a very tight hold on the city, and they used all these extraordinary rules, many of them nothing to do with Islam, to simply control the city. Those have gone. In their place, robberies have increased, looting's increased, and cars are being stolen.
The Taliban leadership escaped from Kabul during Monday night, leaving the rank and file to their own devices. As for the Northern Alliance, although they'd promised to stay out of the city, they did send in small detachments of troops to keep order. It took around 4 hours before things were entirely quiet. The liberated people of Kabul had been helping themselves to whatever their old rulers had left behind. This was a Taliban house. Its last occupants had fled. But this was no ordinary address. It was where foreign volunteers from Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda terrorist network had lived and worked. But they left behind evidence of the planning and preparation that had gone on here. There was a card from a Canadian firm that, among other things, specializes in flight simulators. There were explosives in one storeroom and anti-personnel mines in another. And there was a list of names of senior Al-Qaeda people and a notice which said the military coalition for Qaeda Ansar Allah announces its training program for those who want to join from the nation's youth. And it ends, "We ask God to help us all to work for his sake in the way that he allows us." Upstairs were all sorts of documents connected with explosives, including this manual in English on blowing up bridges and buildings. There were guides for timing mechanisms, booby traps. In the heart of Kabul, there was another large building used by the Taliban as a staging point for volunteers heading for the front. It used to be the Saudi embassy. Then the UN moved in. And then, a year ago, Arab and other foreign recruits were brought here. But it was more than just a reception centre. Weapons training happened here too. Hand grenades were lying around everywhere. And there were other things, these box cutters. It could just be a coincidence, but box cutters were the simple weapon the hijackers used to take over the planes in the attacks of September the 11th.
There's a pile of documents here which we found which haven't been taken away by the security authorities. Personal files. Here there's a passport from the Sudan.
Elsewhere, there were documents which may have been serious or merely fantasies. At the moment, we can't know. This one describes how to create a thermonuclear explosion. These are notes on building a missile. And this document is about ricin, one of the most poisonous, naturally occurring toxins known to man, developed as a biological weapon for terrorist assassination by the Soviet KGB.
Osama bin Laden hijacked the government of this country, much as his supporters hijacked the planes on the 11th of September. He poured money into Afghanistan, and as a result, the Taliban let him stay as long as he wanted. And Mullah Omar, the Taliban leader, not a man of great intelligence or experience, did whatever Osama bin Laden told him to.
A few miles from Jalalabad, the Americans had bombed an Al-Qaeda training camp. Deep craters showed just how heavily. The camp was now in the hands of anti-Taliban troops. There were plenty of unexploded American cluster bombs lying around, and dozens of tanks and armoured personnel carriers, some utterly destroyed, some still intact. At Darunta, another former Al-Qaeda camp, there was more clear evidence of the business that the Al-Qaeda network had been engaged in. There were manuals on how to kill, how, for instance, a pillion passenger should best shoot his victim. The preferred angle, the manual says, is 30 degrees. And there were box loads of chemicals, probably the raw material of explosives. But as well as destroying the infrastructure of Al-Qaeda, the Americans have been targeting its leaders. This week, the second most senior man in Al-Qaeda, Mohammed Atif, its military strategist, was reportedly killed in a US bombing raid near Kabul. Atif's daughter is married to Osama bin Laden's son, and Atif might have taken over as Al-Qaeda's leader.
Mohammed Atif and others who came from Egypt, especially from the Islamic Jihad, had a major role in convincing bin Laden towards revolutionary violence. Their organizational and ideological role was very important. His disappearance means that the Al-Qaeda would not be able to function if bin Laden goes as it has done in the past.
But bin Laden himself remains at liberty. There's a reward of $25 million on his head, and presumably he's hiding in some cave somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan and continuing to preach his holy war against the West. But a fuller picture of bin Laden's recent life is now emerging. He had a place in Kabul as well as his hideout in the mountains. We found out that this was the house where bin Laden's family lived, in an expensive part of Kabul, which he used to visit secretly. We met the landlord, who insisted he had no idea who they were. They moved in last December, he said. The landlord also showed us some photographs which his tenants had left behind. 4 children and their mother. This is another picture of the mother, probably taken some time ago. Part of the house had been bricked up. The landlord explained that the Arabs had done it without his knowledge or permission. The section that was partitioned off must have been where bin Laden would slip in to meet his family. The upstairs windows were blacked out. Downstairs, a hypodermic syringe lay on the floor. Bin Laden is known to suffer from serious health problems. Out in the hall was a German car number plate. When the family moved out in a hurry 3 weeks ago, they changed the number on their car and left the latest installment of the rent unpaid. But the Taliban insist that Osama bin Laden isn't beaten and he's not on the run. And it's become increasingly clear that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban have had such a close relationship, it's impossible to say where one ends and the other begins. I saw the extraordinary hold that the Taliban once exercised when I watched the normally reclusive Taliban leader, Mullah Omar, speaking in public in Kandahar. He rarely gives interviews, but this week Mullah Omar rang the BBC to say that he was undefeated and determined to carry through the grand strategy of destroying America. Mullah Omar was asked about Osama bin Laden's threat to use nuclear, chemical or biological weapons against America.
Mullah Omar's interview with the Pashto service reflected the cry of a desperate man who was repeating his master's voice in desperation, and that is bin Laden, because bin Laden came up with a similar statement to the Muslim world that you have either to choose me or America, and the Muslim world ignored him.
And in Kandahar, in southern Afghanistan, the Taliban's original power base, from which they took control over the whole of Afghanistan, the Taliban were insisting, in a report broadcast by Al Jazeera, that they wouldn't go and they weren't beaten.
They've still got a lot of men. They've still got more support than I think a lot of people in the outside world would give credit for. And they've lost a lot of territory. They're losing more territory. They're shrinking their hold on Afghanistan, but they're not beaten yet.
With the Taliban gone from the capital, the process of creating a new government began. It's not going to be easy. The Northern Alliance is badly divided. Some want the former president, Burhanuddin Rabbani, something of a non-entity, to be the figurehead of the new government. And yesterday, Rabbani himself arrived in Kabul to lay his claim publicly. He was flanked by Dr. Abdullah, the Northern Alliance's foreign minister. But politics in Afghanistan is not for the faint-hearted. We filmed a meeting 10 days ago, before the push on Kabul. where the problem of rebuilding Afghanistan politically became clear. Even Dr. Abdullah, the spokesman for the alliance, said their support for President Rabbani was strictly limited. Rabbani simply brings back too many bad memories of their time in power before.
In Afghanistan, the politics is the politics of survival. Loyalty is an exchangeable commodity. In order to achieve anything in Afghanistan, either you have to have gun or you have to have a position with which to negotiate. And what we are witnessing is exactly that.
And nowhere in recent days did the problems which may plague efforts to build a broad and representative government become more apparent than in Bamiyan near Mazar-i-Sharif in northern Afghanistan. This was a scene of one of the most widely publicized gestures of Taliban fanaticism, the destruction of the famous Bamiyan Buddhas. Here, in one of the first areas to defeat the Taliban, live the Hazaras, who are partly descended from the Mongol armies of Genghis Khan. I first came across the Hazaras 12 years ago. Then, at the height of the war against the Soviet-backed government, their supporters smuggled me into Kabul to witness their resistance. They're mostly Shiite Muslims, and they form 20% of the population. They're anxious to defend their interests in the power share-out that's now approaching. Their military victory against the Taliban was fueled by bales of banknotes, courtesy of the American Special Forces, who are seen here with them. And last week, the money was funding a new endeavour, a small army of Hazaras set off for Kabul. After a brief prayer, they received their orders from their commander.
When you enter the city, most of you may not know it very well, you should observe military order. When you go anywhere, you have to try your best to respect the people and value their honor.
Near the capital, they stop to prepare themselves. But for what? They want to make sure their people get their share of the fruits of victory, which they believe they've earned. This boy, just 9 years old and battle-hardened, told how he'd killed Taliban soldiers just a week earlier in the battle for Bamiyan. He was, he said, fighting for freedom. When their leader goes to press his claim in Kabul next week, he'll be accompanied by 2,000 armed men. In Afghanistan, there's nothing altogether unusual in that.
It's my home. I return to my home. It's not a crime if I go on my own or with 2,000 men. We are not going to fight there. We hate fighting.
They're just one of the many competing tribal and religious interests jostling for position as the spoils of victory are divided up. When the Taliban were able to take power 5 years ago, it was precisely because rivalries such as this had reduced the country to a state of bloody chaos. The worst fear is that much the same could happen all over again.
The whole political map of North Afghanistan has been redrawn during the past month, and the position now is one of what I would describe it as very unstable, and the portents for fighting, in my view, are there. They're building up. You just need one spark of some sort, and the whole thing could become very ugly indeed.
The key figures in establishing stability are the Americans, who played their part in Afghanistan's disasters by losing interest in the country after the Russians were defeated in 1989. Now they're putting on the pressure to get a broadly based government which will represent all parts of the country, especially the 40% who are Pashto speakers. A leading Pashtun politician, Hamid Karzai, is already in Afghanistan, working up support.
I'm absolutely optimistic that Afghans will get together. They were never separated. The separation was a factor mostly from years of war imposed by the former Soviet Union, and then years of neglect by the West, and see the consequences now. And also the neighbors did not cooperate fully to have Afghanistan stabilized. And you had that. How many fronts could we manage on our own?
But Afghanistan's had 20 years of war. It's chock full of military hardware.
They're never going to agree on how to share power within Kabul. So what are they going to do? They're armed and they'll probably use them.
Enter, via Bagram Air Base, the British. Their orders are not just to speed the flow of humanitarian relief, but to act as what's being called a stabilization force. Since they arrived on Friday, they've kept a very low profile, but there's no real conception or understanding of their mission here.
I think it's not a good news for us that the British soldier came to Afghanistan, because we have a lot of soldiers in Afghanistan, and all of our soldiers ready to beat Osama bin Laden, to capture him, and also to destroy him.
I think Britain, America and the West have no alternative but to ensure that they are there as peace builders rather than peacekeepers. Whether they want to do it directly or through the United Nations, it has to be done, because Afghanistan is a fragmented society. The social, political and economic reasons for the current crisis is still there.
But the omens aren't that good. The great powers and the neighbouring countries have always meddled in Afghanistan's affairs, hence the mess the country's in at the moment. What it needs is the right kind of involvement. Mr. Blair has said that Britain isn't going to walk away from Afghanistan, but the American Defence Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, says American forces will help with reconstruction, but won't get involved in long-term peacekeeping. So America, once again, isn't showing much enthusiasm for staying here.
Tonight in Kabul, the most telling change of all. Afghan television went back on air, ending the 5 years of silence and blackout which the Taliban had imposed.
When Taliban came in Afghanistan, I stayed all the time at home. Yeah, and I didn't work when Taliban was here.
Symbolically, Lidi Azimi's was the first face to appear. Women are no longer to be silent and unseen here.
After 5 years, when I came here, I feel very happiness, and I think life is now enjoyable for me.
Now for the difficult part, helping to build a new Afghanistan in a country famous for defeating the best efforts of outsiders. And Osama bin Laden is still at large. 2 months after the 11th of September, the first battle of Afghanistan may have been won, but the long march in the war against terrorism has only just started. If you'd like to comment on the issues raised in this programme, you can visit our website at www.bbc.co.uk/panorama.